you create the narrative. It's your narrative that is going to embody and define the identity of your home. You go in some people's home, the vibe in the house is a little different from the vibe in someone else's house, and that's the same idea. What the philosopher does is the philosopher has the right to lie, because the philosopher recognizes, and this is going to be really, really elitist, but this is really what's happening. And Plato says this in not so many words, and I'm sure a whole bunch of Platonists will disagree with this, but he does. It's that, listen, John and Jane Doe aren't going to be able to understand the truths of metaphysics. They're not going to be able to understand ontological truths, right? It's up to us, the philosophers, to decipher that very complex bits of information and tell you a story. And this is going to be powerful much later, right? We have to tell you a good story, a story that's easy to understand. And to be honest with you, this is how I live my life, right? Except I take out the fact that I really know anything. I'm a good Platonist in that. The one thing I know is that I don't know. And I'm always looking for more truth. But the idea is, there is a world of truth out there, and that world of truth is extremely complicated to assess. Extremely complicated. Physicists, sociologists, theater majors, dance majors spend their life trying to understand, like a dance major spends her life trying to understand a body's motion in space. It can be extremely profoundly complicated, right? To describe that understanding to you is extremely difficult. What I'm doing now is complicated. It's much easier for you to watch me, just watch me. And this is why what I do is a more process-based philosophy. It's easier for you to understand in the auditorium the ability of a body to move through space by watching a dancer dance, rather than understanding the mechanics of what she or he is doing in space. So, the lie is easier to tell and to digest than the truth. Okay. Number two. I didn't mean to spend that much time on that, but this is going to be very important, as we'll see later. The philosopher priests have power, authority, and credibility. Right? This is a direct quote from note 141. The philosopher priest, and I'll just abbreviate this P-P. So P-P is philosopher priest. The philosopher priest must have power, authority, and credibility. Right? Power, authority, and credibility. Right? Power, authority, and credibility. He attains, the philosopher priest, attains the power, authority, and credibility from the creation of the moral system and the highest moral imperatives, as I said before, right? As the priest makes an appeal to God, and God then imbues the priest with power, so too does the philosopher-priest. So too does the philosopher priest, which is my sort of concept, make an appeal to the highest moral values, reason, whatever, consistency, logic. It might be a particular discipline, rationalism, empiricism, what have you. And insofar as I make that appeal, I gain power to control from that appeal. We've done this quite a bit, right? So, the philosopher priest attains power, authority, and credibility from what? From the highest moral, values. Alright, so I make an appeal to the highest moral values. Insofar as I make that appeal, I gain power from those values. We've talked about that pretty extensively. Number 3, everything affecting the individual must be determined by their law. I actually want to read this bit in note 141, and this is pretty important. So note 141, if you're following along in the text, it's on page 90, and it's about, I don't know, like halfway through. There's a dash and it says they. They have to set aside the concept of natural course of events, but since they are clever and thoughtful people, they are able to promise a host of effects, conditions, of course, by prayers or strict observance of their law. They can, moreover, prescribe, right? Prescription, moral, just like morality, just like religious ideology is based on prescription, what you ought to do. prescribe a host of things that are abundantly reasonable, provided only that they do not point to experience or empiricism as a source of this wisdom, but to revelation or the consequence of their sternness, right? So it's like, I make an appeal, the philosopher priest, right? I, the philosopher priest, and this is, we'll say this is the masses, right? I make an appeal to the moral imperative. Insofar as I make an appeal to the moral imperative, I then use that moral imperative to say what you ought to do, or what you must do. Right? So I tell the masses, here's what you ought to do, here's what you must do. I make an appeal to that, and then based on that appeal, I tell them what they ought to do, what they must do. If it's the case that the masses come and they inquire, right? If the masses then come and they inquire to me, why ought I do X, whatever it is, what I tell them in response is a lie. I create a narrative, something that they can understand. So, for example, if in an assessment of, I don't know, human rights, for example, you were to tell people, listen, based on Mills's concept and Bentham's concept of utilitarianism, and this one version of it being a consequentialist derivation, that we can incorporate consequentialist ethic into our political paradigm, and then in that regard justify the actions of the National Socialist Party as Adolf Hitler rose to power, because in a sense his concerns were of a consequentialist nature rather than sort of the sanctity of life, right? The definitive truth that all human beings are created equal. The masses wouldn't have any idea of what I just said. What does that even mean? I don't know what he said. Why? Because I'm just regurgitating jargon, right? Very complex notions of sort of both social order and moral imperatives. What's done is I construct a lie, something that's easy to understand, a narrative that's easy to digest, right? There's bits of truth in it, but really it's been watered down and distilled so much that it now becomes sort of, it becomes like a cliff note, right? It becomes a cliff note to the truth. It points to the truth, but it itself is vapid, right? There really isn't any contextual meat to it. So this is sort of what happens, right, with the philosopher-priest. And this is obviously the philosopher-priest, the philosopher who ascribes to the methodology of the priestly class, according to Nietzsche, has the same flaws. He believes that there's a better form of philosophy. There's a better philosopher. We haven't gotten into that yet, but this is a philosopher who's still informed by the methodological practices and appeals that a priest might make, right? And he's going to fall into the same problems, right? The priest makes an appeal to God rather than the moral imperative, right? So the priest would make an appeal to God. That appeal would tell everybody what they must do. People would ask, why do I have to do what God tells me to do? And you would tell them a lie, according to Nietzsche. Well, if you don't do it, you're going to go to hell. If you don't do it, if you don't baptize your baby's going to go to hell. If you use condoms and you're married, you're going to go to hell. Right? Now, I'm not trying to piss people off, right? That's not my intent. We left all the trolls back in video 18. But that's the idea. Right? The appeal is exactly the same, right? You create something, you create a narrative in which you lie, in a sense, to the population, according to Nietzsche, and that lie is used to reinforce what you told them to do in the first place, right? So you can see that the process is exactly the same. I gave you sort of a cycle of this process via the philosopher-priest, and a cycle of this process via the priest proper. Okay, I think that makes sense now. It should. Alright, so we know that. 3 is, so that's the first part. Alright, so everything affecting the individual must be determined by their law. Explain what that was. Philosopher-priest, determined